The nylon walls caved in like a lung giving its last breath, and Mara Delgado was on her knees in freezing mud before she even understood what was happening. Thunder cracked so close it felt like the sky itself had split open above the campground, and in that single flash of white lightning, she saw the broken tent pole jutting through the collapsed fabric like a bone through skin. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking through her jacket, her boots, her last dry pair of socks, and for one terrifying second she thought she might actually cry out loud in the dark, alone, 40 miles from the nearest town. If this story moves something in you already, do me a favor before we go any further, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel if kindness is something you still believe in. Now, let's get back to Mara. She had come to the mountains to disappear for a while. 3 months earlier, she had buried her mother after a 2-year battle with illness that drained every dollar she had and every ounce of hope she carried. The funeral had been small, quiet, attended by people who didn't know what to say, and afterward, Mara had sold most of what she owned, packed a tent, a sleeping bag, and a single duffel bag into her old hatchback, and driven north until the roads turned to gravel and the gravel turned to dirt. She told herself it was a hiking trip. Really, it was an escape. She needed silence that didn't remind her of hospital machines, air that didn't smell like antiseptic, and a version of herself that wasn't defined by grief. For 2 weeks it had worked. She hiked until her legs burned, cooked simple meals over a small camp stove, watched sunsets paint the ridgelines gold, and slept under a sky so full of stars it almost made her believe in something bigger than her own sadness. But that night, the storm had rolled in without warning, and now everything she owned was collapsing around her in the mud, literally and figuratively, and she had nowhere else to go. She sat there for a moment, drenched, shaking, staring at the ruined tent, feeling the cold seep into her bones in a way that felt less like weather and more like an ending. It would have been easy to simply give up right there, to let the rain wash over her until morning, numb and defeated. But somewhere in the dark, past the tree line, she saw a small square of warm light glowing through the downpour, a lantern hanging from another camper's tent, maybe 200 feet away. She didn't know him. She had seen him once, briefly, 2 days earlier, gathering firewood alone near the creek, a tall man in his 50s with a gray beard and tired eyes, the kind of tired that comes from something deeper than a long hike. He had nodded politely, she had nodded back, and that had been the extent of their entire acquaintance. But right now, pride felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, and survival had a way of stripping away everything except the truth of what a person needs in a moment of crisis. She grabbed her flashlight, tucked her soaked sleeping bag under one arm, and half-walked, half-stumbled through the mud and rain toward that small square of light, her heart hammering with something between fear and desperation. When she reached his tent, she stood outside it for a long moment, drenched to the bone, feeling foolish and small, before she finally found the courage to knock against the wet fabric. The man unzipped the flap and looked out at her, blinking against the rain, and in that moment, Mara didn't even have the strength for a full introduction. She simply said, voice trembling, barely audible over the storm, "My tent collapsed. Yours has room for 2, right?" There was a pause, just long enough to make her regret everything, long enough for old fears to whisper that she was intruding, that strangers don't owe each other kindness, that she should have stayed out in the rain and suffered quietly rather than ask for help. But then the man's face softened, and without a single word of hesitation, he pulled the flap open wider and said simply, "Get in before you freeze." His name was Walter, and as it turned out, he had not come to these mountains by accident either. Over the next hour, as the storm raged outside and the two of them sat wrapped in the only dry blanket he had, sharing a thermos of lukewarm coffee, Walter told her that he had lost his wife of 31 years to cancer just 8 months earlier, and that the silence of his empty house back in the city had become unbearable. He had come to the wilderness not to hike, not really, but to remember what it felt like to breathe without the weight of grief pressing down on his chest every single second. Mara listened, stunned by how closely his story mirrored her own, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than isolation. She felt seen. She told him about her mother, about the hospital bills, about the guilt she still carried for not being able to do more, for not being there every single moment, even though she had sacrificed nearly everything she had. Walter listened without judgment, nodding slowly, understanding in a way that only someone who had walked a similar road could understand. The rain didn't let up that night. It hammered against the tent for hours, but inside, something had shifted. Two strangers who had each been drowning quietly in their own private storms had found, quite by accident, a small square of shelter that was warm not just because of the lantern, but because of the simple, radical act of showing up for one another. By morning, the storm had passed, and the campground was littered with fallen branches and puddles reflecting a pale, watery sun. Mara's tent was beyond saving, the pole snapped clean through, the fabric torn in two places. She stood over the wreckage with Walter beside her, and instead of despair, she found herself laughing, a tired, disbelieving laugh, at how something so small could feel like the end of the world just hours before. Walter offered to drive her into the nearest town to buy a replacement, and during that hour-long drive down winding mountain roads, they talked more, about her mother's love of gardening, about his wife's terrible but beloved cooking, about the strange, unexpected comfort of finding someone who didn't need an explanation for grief because they were living inside their own version of it. By the time they reached the little hardware store in town, something had changed between them, not romantic, not dramatic, just human. Two broken people, quietly rebuilding a small piece of themselves in each other's company. Over the following days, they continued to camp near one another, not out of obligation, but out of a mutual, unspoken understanding that healing sometimes happens best beside someone who doesn't require you to explain your pain. Walter taught her how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds rolling over the ridgeline. Mara showed him a small trick her mother used to make bitter camp coffee taste sweeter, using a pinch of cinnamon she still carried in her bag out of habit. They cooked meals together over the fire, shared stories long after the sun went down, and slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, the crushing weight they had each carried alone into those mountains began to feel just a little lighter. On her last night before heading back to the city, Mara sat by the fire with Walter, watching sparks drift up into a sky full of stars, and she found herself saying something she hadn't said out loud in months. She told him that she had honestly considered, more than once during her mother's illness and in the lonely weeks after, whether she even wanted to keep going, whether life without her mother's laughter, her mother's phone calls, her mother's unwavering belief in her, was a life worth continuing. Walter didn't flinch. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder and told her that grief was not a weakness, that surviving it, even clumsily, even on your knees in the mud during a storm, was its own quiet form of courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is knock on a stranger's tent and ask for shelter instead of suffering alone in silence. That night became a turning point neither of them fully understood until much later. Mara returned to the city with Walter's phone number saved in her contacts, not out of romance, but out of something rarer, a genuine friendship forged in the middle of a storm, between two people who had both lost the person who made them feel most at home in the world. In the months that followed, they checked in on each other regularly. Walter eventually started volunteering at a grief support center, telling anyone who would listen about the night a stranger's collapsed tent had reminded him that connection, even fleeting, even unexpected, could pull a person back from the edge of complete despair. Mara, in turn, found the courage to start therapy, to slowly rebuild her life, to garden again the way her mother once had, planting tomatoes and marigolds on the small balcony of her city apartment as a quiet tribute to the woman who raised her. If this story touched even a small part of your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness between strangers can change the entire course of a life. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who need them most. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something. Down in the comments, I'd love for you to share a time when a stranger's small act of kindness helped you through a storm of your own, whether that storm was literal or something quieter, carried silently inside. Your stories matter, and someone reading them might need to hear exactly what you have to say. Mara never forgot that night in the rain, the sound of the tent collapsing, the fear that gripped her chest, and the trembling question she asked a stranger she barely knew. She learned that vulnerability, the simple act of admitting you need help, can sometimes be the very thing that saves you. And Walter never forgot the sound of that knock on his tent flap either, a sound that reminded him he still had something left to give, that his own grief hadn't hollowed him out completely, that there was still room, quite literally, for someone else. 2 strangers, 2 storms, 1 small shelter, and a friendship that proved even in our darkest, wettest, most broken moments, we are never quite as alone as we think, as long as we are brave enough to ask for room.